I appreciate your taking the time to watch this session. My name is Cindy Quinlan. I had taught for several years at a Christian school in Northern Virginia, and I now work with Abeka as an educational consultant, although I occasionally have opportunity to teach some high school classes at Pensacola Christian Academy. As you've noticed, the title of this session is Review, Build Longevity into Learning. And sometimes when we hear the term review, we think, oh, that's a term I've heard before. The banality of it or the quotidian aspect of it is something that we easily dismiss and say, if I want to improve as a teacher, I need to focus on something a little more new, something with a little more pizzazz. But I hope that you are able to see review is one of the most important principles that you can apply to your teaching. And when applied well, it will help you strengthen your students' learning, it will help you challenge their thinking, and it will help you push your students further ahead than they otherwise would have been. Now, my dad's family is from Kansas, so at an early age, I fell in love with Kansas. In fact, my favorite flower is the Kansas state flower, which is the sunflower. But one of the aspects of Kansas that really draws me to it is those wide open plains. So I'd like you to not only picture, but in fact, you're going to be able to see one of the wide open plains that you might see in Kansas. This particular field in front of you is a wheat field. So imagine, if you can, that you were to walk from one end of this wheat field to the other. By the time you get to the other side and you look back, you realize you've created a path where there hadn't been. There's some broken down wheat stalks, there's some bent wheat stalks, and there is now a path. Well, if you wanted that path to be more permanent, to be more easy to maneuver and traverse in the future, you would need to keep walking back and forth on that path in order to make it more obvious. Well, that's a very simplified example of what happens in our students' brains. You see, when our students learn something new, the neurons in the brains, they create a new mental pathway to that new knowledge that the students have. And so when they learn something for the first time, there's a path, but that path isn't necessarily permanent. It's not necessarily easy to walk up and down yet. It still needs to be trodden down. And every time you review with them, what you are doing is you are making them go down that mental pathway to grasp and bring back that new knowledge. And every time they go down that pathway, it makes it more permanent. And that's why we challenge all of us to use review to build longevity into that learning. Now, in this session, I've divided it into two main parts. The first part we'll spend the most time on, and that is simply daily review. It's the most important. But the second part that we'll finish with is cumulative or test review. Now, in that first part of daily review, I'd like us to look at it from three different aspects. And so as you self-assess, as you reflect on this last school year and this coming school year and your plans for this coming school year, or you might even be a new teacher and you don't have a previous school year to reflect on, but you are looking forward and planning for the coming school year. And as you think of what are your plans of implementing review, challenge yourself in these three areas, and that is variety, frequency, and then intensity. Let's look at the first one, variety. Now, there are multiple ways of review. We're only going to have time to bring up a couple. The first one is probably the most common. But again, just like review itself, just because it's common or well known doesn't mean it is any less powerful or less important. And that first one is oral questions. What I challenge you to do, if you haven't done so in the past, or if you've not yet put concrete plans into action, is to set aside a couple of minutes in every single lesson where you ask your students questions over previous covered material. If you've never done that before, at least start with 5 questions or 5 to 8 questions. And then maybe as you get more comfortable with it, you'll be able to quickly build up with more questions. But that first one of oral questions, the beauty of it is it requires simply your brain and your mouth and your students' brains and their mouths in order for it to take place. we're going to watch a brief clip of a junior high science class. And in this clip, we will start with the beginning of that quick oral review, and then we'll skip ahead just to the end. And I want you to note how the teacher just simply asks students questions over previous material, and in so doing, encourages them to mentally walk down that path, retrieve that information, and make that pathway stronger, more obvious for the future.
Chloe, my first question to you is, what is the name of that erroneous idea that everything is material and that nothing is spiritual?
Materialism.
Excellent. Good. What is the idea that living things arise from non-living things?
Spontaneous generation.
Yes, good. God's revelation of himself through his creation is known as what type of revelation? There's only two types here. While he's thinking, can we double check our books are closed, not open? Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Back to you. Well, what are the two types of revelation? Riley, help him out with that. The two types are?
Special and general.
Special and general. So back to Luke. Luke, God's revelation through his creation. What we see is special or general?
General.
General, yes, very good. So Riley, the sun, the moon, the stars teach God's glory in a language all people can understand. What term describes these heavenly bodies? General or special?
General.
It is general. Good. That's another one there too. And we'll stop right there. Awesome.
As you see, it's not complicated, it's not complex, and it doesn't have to be effective. Now, a couple of things that you can take from this clip is, besides the fact that that is the consistent practice of the teacher in every lesson, is notice that she had written her review questions down. And if this is not a practice that you have applied yet, I challenge you to do so. As you seek to improve in this coming year, maybe you can improve in the way of writing those questions down ahead of time. That enables you to ask the questions a little faster. They're right in front of you. You can go from one question to the other. But it also enables you to make sure you have thoroughly covered the concepts that you've wanted to review. And it often lets you ask some deeper thinking questions that you might not have considered if you were just coming up with questions off the top of your head. So perhaps one way that you can level up in the area of review is simply to write your questions down. The second aspect from that clip that I want to point out to you is, notice how she held the students responsible for the knowledge. They might not have known the answer, but she didn't just give the answer and move on. Instead, she actually put together a couple different strategies. One was, if the student doesn't know the answer, you ask leading questions to get them to that answer. In this case, even the leading question the student wasn't able to know. So the teacher did a second tactic. She went to another student, had that student supply the answer, then went back to the first. So she was still holding that student ultimately responsible. One tactic that I also use occasionally is simply tell the student, all right, look it up, I'll come back to you. And I'll ask a few other students questions and then come back to that student. If you have the page number, if you are aware of where the location of that information that he's a little bit hazy on, you could even direct him to there specifically. But ultimately, hold the student responsible for the knowledge that he should know. And the last aspect of that clip that I want to mention is, in the clip, notice how the teacher went down one row and up the next. In fact, if you've watched other Abeka Academy videos, you've probably noticed that that is a common practice. Realize that is only a common practice because of the constraints of video as well as microphone. In a normal class where you're not having to work around what the video can pan to see and work around the students always answering in a microphone, you do not want to go up and down the rows. Instead, you want to ask your students questions randomly. Because if you go up and down the row, then the students on the other side of the class, they know that it is safe to check out because you're not going to get to them anytime soon. But if you ask students questions randomly, they all have to be ready to answer because they never know when you're going to call on them. So the benefit of that is keeping them on their toes, and it also keeps the energy of the class up as well. So as long as you have opportunity to do that, do ask students questions randomly. Now, another way in which we can keep the review varied in our class is to take advantage of the parts of the class that are naturally built in. For example, homework. Homework is a natural part of every lesson, but we should be using homework purposefully to get in some extra review. There are two types of homework. There's homework that is done for preparation, like history, science homework, and there is homework that is done for practice, like math homework. Well, preparation homework can still have those elements of review in it because whatever they're preparing for, they're still building off previous knowledge that you've taught. That's what you want to review. For example, in front of you, you see an example of a junior high science homework question. It is, list 4 ways that monocots and dicots differ from each other. Certainly, as you go over the homework, you want them to supply that answer from the reading. But either before you hear that specific question or maybe after it, do some review by asking them, well, what are monocots and dicots? And hopefully they're able to tell you what you've taught them, and that is based upon the number of cotyledons in the plant. And then you might even say, and what is a cotyledon? So you take the basic homework question and you build on it and you add that review. There's 2 benefits of this. The first is realize that if whenever you go over homework, you're just having students read the answers that they've written down, they can go through homework time without thinking. Maybe they thought when they wrote the question down, but now all they have to do is read it to you. So by interspersing some extra questions, you're keeping their brains active. The second benefit of building in some purposeful review to homework review is the fact that you're showing the connections between what they're learning now and what they have learned in the past. And one other example of this from literature, the question might be, how is personification used in this particular poem? That is something we want them to answer, but we also want to make sure, what is the definition of personification? Do they know that? And then we might also review a poem from a previous lesson. What was the personification that was used in Longfellow's Hiawatha's Childhood? So again, intersperse some of that homework review with review questions. Now, the second type of homework, as I said, is homework for practice. So we think of specifically a math class, but this could also apply to grammar. When the students come into class, have them put their work on the board, so that as you go over homework review, it's not you just reading out the answers to the math problems and the students checking their work to seeing if they're right or wrong, but instead going by the problems on the board and having the students explain their work. So not only are they visualizing it for you and the rest of the class, but they're explaining it. You're getting some excellent feedback of how well they understood the steps, and the classmates are getting some excellent review of the thinking process to solve that problem. Now, because of time and space, you're likely not going to be able to put every math problem on the board. So choose which ones you want demonstrated. And as you're about to see in the next clip, for problems that didn't get put on the board, the teacher will simply transition from the problem on the board, ask a student for the answer of a problem not on the board, and then transition to the next problem on the board.
Number 4, Jack.
So I had to do a triangle, and so I had to do 1/2 BH, and my base was 36 and my height was 19. So I used the 1/2 on 36 to make 18, and then I multiplied 19 by 18 and I got 342 centimeters, and since it's a metric unit, I used the little 2 exponent.
Good. So it'd be 342 centimeters squared. Awesome job with number 4. Number 5, this one you had to change to improper fractions before you multiplied. Natalie, what did you get for your area?
A equals 9 meters squared.
9 meters squared. Very good. You have to change those to improper fractions before you can multiply them. Number 6, Mackenzie.
The formula was A equals 1/2 H times B1 plus B2, and then the height was 7 and the 2 bases were 10 and 21. Then I added the 10 and 21, I got 31, and then I multiplied the 7 and the 31 and divided it by 2, and I got 1,085 feet squared.
Okay, the only thing is you missed your decimal. It would be 108.5 feet squared would be your answer there. Okay, however, this is actually talking about yards, so it actually would be 108.5 square yards. Okay, any questions on that one?
One of your biggest challenges in math class is time. You only want to spend so much time going over the math homework. It's critical, but don't make it over flow into the lesson time and into practice time. So notice how this teacher didn't have to re-explain every problem. She simply let her students do the explanations. When there was a slight error, she simply made a quick correction. That's helping homework go quickly. There are some teachers that choose to ask pointed review questions while the students are explaining. The benefit is they get some great thinking questions involved and great review. The drawback is sometimes the extra time that takes. So you want to balance between those two approaches, and depending on the lesson, maybe use one more than the other. Now, another area that we can use to add variety to our review is also built into the class lesson, and that is classwork. That is the short assignment that students are doing while you're taking attendance and checking homework. Your Abeka lesson plans will often give some suggestions for classwork. In history and science, it's typically identify these terms or finish answering some of the questions from the section review. So they're very review oriented. In fact, if you are teaching intermediate math or pre-algebra in this coming year, you'll notice that every lesson's classwork assignment are built-in review problems within that day's lesson. So that just gives you the added bonus of the review is right there at your fingertips. But you can also choose to adapt those classwork assignments to what you know your students need to spend extra time on. For example, in history and science, at the end of each unit, you have your unit review. And it often includes some higher level thinking questions. We might call them essay questions. Well, rather than wait for the students to answer those at the end of the unit, start bringing those into your classwork times and have the students respond to an explain question in science or a concept to know question in history. And then at the end of classwork time, go over the answers, help them fill in some details that they might have left out. And then in the next week during classwork, give them the same question again, because we want to force them to walk down that mental pathway. This time, if they're answering the question again, hopefully it's a little easier for them. Hopefully their answer is a little more robust and includes some of those smaller details that they might have missed the first time. So there's a lot of flexibility that you can have with classwork, and it's great to use as a review component and element in your class. Now, no matter where or what you're reviewing, you also want to involve as many senses as possible with your students. So use visuals. Try to get them to not only hear something and say something, try to get them to see something as well. Certainly your curriculum provides many digital teaching aids that you use to teach from. Incorporate those into your review as well. You see here a chart of the interior of the heart. Well, it took me just a few minutes to go and cover those labels, and I could now use this with my students when reviewing the parts of the heart. In fact, if I had the opportunity to project this on a surface on which the students could write, I could make 2 images of the interior of the heart with both of the labels blacked out, and then I could have a relay between the students and my team. Which team can be the first to accurately label all the parts of the heart there? You can also simply use an image to help a student explain a concept. For example, if you've taught the monsoon effect and now you're working with your students and you might say, explain the monsoon effect. Of course, having the student make that explanation is going to make sure that he does understand it. But rather than just have him explain it verbally, reflect or show this picture and then have him come to the front of the class and have him use the picture to explain the monsoon effect to his students. Adds that visual element. Another aspect of visuals is physical objects. Always bring in a physical object whenever you can. When I was reviewing vocabulary words that centered around picnic items in my Spanish class, I was able to bring in physical objects, whether plastic utensils or a picnic blanket or salt and pepper shakers. And as we reviewed those vocab terms through the week, I would pull up the physical objects so that the students had something that they could not only see, but something that they could even touch as the occasion warranted, and which they would use that when they translated those questions. This past year, I was relegated more to 2D objects, and that was pictures with vocab, but it still added that visual element. Something else that nearly all of us have immediate access to is a chalkboard or a whiteboard, or again, some writing surface. And I challenge you that as you're reviewing content, you may jot down what the students are giving back to you, whether it's a chart or a diagram or a list. And again, that helps them see, not just hear and say. Plus, they might need to use it later as some type of reference. So anytime you can visualize and even jot down on a writing surface what the students are feeding back to you, that will be a help to you. Another aspect of visuals that you can use is flashcards. For some of you math teachers, you have flashcards that are incorporated into your curriculum. Use these. Use them often. They do great for games. They do great for time-sensitive relays. Often, you may even make your own flashcards. Through the years, whether I've been teaching English vocabulary or Spanish grammar, I will often make my own flashcards. And again, it helps me know that I have multiple options right in front of me. It helps me get through them quickly, and it just adds that visual element to what students are reviewing. So when you think of the variety in your review, maybe you've already mastered consistency. You do it every day. Maybe you've already mastered thorough questions, but now can you add in the element of visual or some sort of physical object that you can bring in with your review? The last topic of variety that we're going to discuss in today's session is simply written responses. Anytime you have the students answer orally, just switch that and occasionally have them answer in a written form. This is particularly beneficial for maybe higher level thinking questions where they would now have time to write out. You might even say, write 3 or 4 sentences answering this question. Now they have time to think it through, and you know that writing is thinking, but also you can immediately make sure that everyone is participating because they have to physically pick up their pen and write. And it gives you time to go up and down the rows and see their answers. And you're getting feedback from multiple students of how well they know. Plus, you've got some muscle movement in there as part of the review. So excellent to involve lots of senses, give you some good feedback, and really up the thinking level involved. But it doesn't all have to be just multiple sentence responses. You can also use some type of slate. What I do for my students is I'll take construction paper and I'll laminate it. And so I'll often ask them to pull out their slates and I'll ask them questions and they all have to write the answer on their slate. Again, you can see instantly that everybody's involved. There's physical movement and it gives you great feedback because when they hold up their slates, I can see multiple students' answers and I can see how well most of my class is doing on that concept. So slates are great for writing names or dates. You know that heart chart that we saw earlier? You could just point to parts of the heart and they would have to write the name of that part on their slate. And then you can either have them show it to you or they have to hop up from their seats. I like to add that element in sometimes just to keep them active and moving. So written responses, how could you simply replace some of the times that you ask them orally with some writing? So that is some ideas for adding some variety to your review. Before we move to the next point of frequency, let me quickly give you some other, you might consider them game ideas, but now and then we just like to add a little bit of competition to our daily review. Of course, there's the first way of just asking questions to students randomly. At other times, you might have everyone in the class stand, and as you ask them questions, they sit. So by the end of that review, everyone will have answered at least one question correctly because they needed to sit. Or everyone start by sitting, and as you ask questions, they hop up if they know the answer, and if they answered it correctly, they stay standing. So here again, you're making sure everyone's answering at least one question. Another way of reviewing that kind of works off this is have everyone stand and ask questions through the whole class. Whoever remains standing, in other words, they answered correctly, now goes to round 2. Now you ask round 2 questions, and anyone who answered incorrectly or didn't know, they sit down, so now you're left with whoever's standing, and you go into round 3 or round 4 until you get down to 2 students and then ultimately 1 student. So just a little bit of elimination, add a little competition to that review. Another idea, and some of these we kind of know, we just get out of the habit of doing them in class, but that is row competitions. Ask a question to this row, and the student who answers first is the winner from that row. Go to row number 2, do the same thing. Ultimately, you'll have a winner from each row. So then the next question you ask is just between each row's winner, and you'll see who's the ultimate class winner. And so you have a little quick competition with just 5 or 6 questions. In addition to that type of row competition, you can have another one. And that is where, let's say you have 4 or 5 rows in your classroom with 4 or 5 desks in each row. Have the student seated in the first chair of each row go and stand by the last chair of his row. So you have multiple contestants for this first round. Ask them a set of questions, and every time a student answers correctly, he takes 1 step ahead. He moves ahead 1 seat because he's just standing by the seat. And ultimately, the first student from that group of contestants that can get to the front of his row now earns a point for his team. And so he sits down and everybody else in that round sits down, and now you go to the students seated in the second chair and they go to the back of their row and you ask them questions and who's the first to get to the front of their row. I actually stole that idea from lower elementary, but it works just fine with any age of the students. Another thing that again we may know of, but we've just not used it as commonly in our repertoire, is board relays. If you're asking them quick questions, have them go to the board and write the answer. Usually you'll have 2 teams and you have a representative from each team at the board. When you do board relays, for the students not at the board, have them pull out their slates and they also have to ask the question. That keeps everybody involved. Plus, if neither student at the board knew the answer, then you could say open, and any student in his seat who has the right answer written down, he can pop up and he can show you and get a point for his team. The last way is to simply divide the class into 2 teams. And each person has a number, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. So that there's at least 1 representative from each team with that number. So you might ask a question and then say 4. And so both students that are 4 now have the opportunity who can answer first and win a point for their team. So asking a question, then tagging on the number at the end keeps everybody on their toes because they don't know if you are going to call on them. And they can either run up to the board and write their answer, or they can just hop up if you want it to be speedier and pop out their answer there. So those are just some ideas to add a little bit of spice maybe to some of that daily review. As I said, I want to look at 3 aspects of daily review. The first is variety. The second is frequency. And we're going to go quickly through frequency, but I just want you to reflect on when you review. A lot of what we've talked about this time naturally falls at the beginning of the lesson. And that works fine. Homework review is at the beginning. Classwork is at the beginning. When you're reviewing the previous lesson, you do so at the beginning. It's a perfect transition into new concepts. But don't just review at the beginning. Instead, it is good for you to stop and review in the middle of class too, especially if you're a science teacher or a history teacher and you've got many concepts that you're covering. Before you move from one concept to the next, about every 5, 7, 10 minutes, stop and review what you just taught. Now, don't summarize it. That's a very passive review for the students. They're hearing it again, but they're not necessarily mentally retrieving it themselves. So instead, ask them questions. For example, we just finished the aspect of variety. I could ask you, so what are some ways of adding variety into your review? And ask from you, and you would provide that to me, and it would keep it a little more firm in your mind. And then, of course, we can also benefit by adding review at the end. This, again, is very applicable more to our reading subjects, because typically in a skills-based subject, they're spending the last half of class working and applying and practicing what they've learned. But in history or science, if you end with 2 or 3 great questions that really focus in on the main points that you're trying to teach, it helps them walk away knowing what the main point of that lesson was. And if you've prepared those questions ahead of time, it helps you know what to focus your teaching on as well. So even though we spent very short amount of time on the frequency of review, there's a lot here that you might consider. And if you're good with variety and consistency of review, maybe ask yourself, could I make sure that I'm reviewing throughout the lesson, not just at the designated time at the beginning? The third aspect of daily review that I want us to look at is simply intensity. And that's just a one-word way of saying review the thinking process with your students. It's that thinking process that they apply and that shows that true understanding. Here's what I mean by that. Look at this sentence in front of you. Tyrese places his pen inside his desk. I could ask you, what's the direct object? In that case, I'm asking you for the answer. I'm not reviewing the thinking process, which is fine. If your whole class should know what a direct object is by now and should be comfortable with it, it's great to go straight to the answer. But when you've just taught it, or if it's something that's still challenging for them, it's good to review the thinking process. Ask them, what's the first thing I need to do with the sentence in order to find the direct object? What's the second thing? Build it up to the answer. You might even add, how did you know that desk was not the direct object? Here's another example. I could ask, what's the value of x? That's going straight for the answer. But if I want to review the thinking process, I would say, what's the first thing I need to do to simplify this equation? What's the next thing I do? How do I do that? And talk them through the thinking process that would get them to the fact that x equals 11. I did this multiple times through the year, but what comes especially to mind is some lessons that I had to teach near the end of the year, Unit 10 of Spanish 1. My students were studying stem-changing verbs, which are simply verbs in Spanish that when you conjugate them, they have a spelling change that occurs. Well, what is tricky about this is that spelling change is different based upon the tense in which you're conjugating them. If you're conjugating them in the present tense or the past or preterite tense or present progressive, there's different rules to apply for each time. So I needed to make sure that my students had those details down before I could simply say, conjugate el verbo preferir, or in this case, mentir. So even as I taught those, I tried to physically organize them so they could see it in their mind, as you see in the screen in front of you. But I also wanted to review those details before I simply said conjugate this verb. And so in this next clip, we're going to hop right into the middle of one of those reviews. We've already reviewed the present tense rules with stem-changing verbs. Now we're hopping into the preterite. So I'm asking the students to supply some of the specific details before we apply it as a class through conjugation, and then before I challenge individual students to show their understanding through conjugation as well.
Honor, what are some things I should remember about preterite tense stem-changing verbs? Gabriel, you be ready to give us some details too, because there's more than one detail we want to remember. What comes to mind?
Do you put like IE?
Okay, it is going to be E, but the E is not going to change to IE like it does in the present tense. The E is just going to change to I. So it is just E to I. Give me some more details, Gabriel.
It's only in third person.
Okay, only in the third person, singular and plural. One very crucial detail is what, Sierra? Shout it out. It's only IR verbs that stem change in the preterite. So clase, el verbo pensar en el pretérito would be what? Pensé, pensaste, pensó, pensamos, pensasteis, pensaron. No stem changing verb. El verbo defender en el pretérito, clase. Defendí, defendiste, defendió, defendimos, defendisteis, defendieron. There is no stem change. Why was there no stem change for pensar and defender, Abigail? In the preterite, I should clarify that we just did it in. Why not?
Because they're not IR verbs.
Perfect answer, because only IR verbs stem change in the preterite, which means what we've all been waiting for, clase, en el pretérito, sentí, sentiste, sintió, sentimos, sentisteis, sintieron. Amaya, you and your side of the class, go ahead and stand. You're going to conjugate mentir for me one at a time.
Now, we cut off right before you heard some of the individual student responses, but notice that's another tip to add to your review, is it's good to intermix individual responses with some group responses. I probably do it more in a Spanish class than you would do in your English or history or science class, simply because one of the keys of Spanish is repetition, 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 and I want them to all pick up on the almost chant-like repetition that comes to conjugating verbs. But it's still okay to occasionally have the whole class answer, just to add a little bit more energy and enthusiasm before you go back to some of those individual answers. Now, let me again reiterate what I mean by review the thinking process, and I'm going to do that just by some symbols in front of you. If a concept is new or still challenging to the students, what you can do is ask questions that lead up to the application. And that makes sure, especially your struggling students who still don't quite understand it yet, are hearing and are having to mentally retrieve the different processes that they need to apply. Once the students are comfortable, they're familiar with the concept, then when you review it, you do go straight to the application. Go straight to the answer. What is the value of X? What is the direct object in this sentence? And occasionally, just to keep them thinking and to keep the knowledge fresh in their minds, you will then go back and ask some questions. How did you get that answer? What was the first thing you did to solve that problem? And you use those details to lead up to that application. This is also great when you are working with a student who you asked him what's the direct object or what's the value of X, and he answered incorrectly, or he at least seemed very uncertain. If that's the case, instead of just giving him the answer, you ask those leading questions that will get him to what the right answer is. Because most of our students just need to be shown you have the knowledge, it's just a matter of putting it together to get that answer. So in that case, ask those questions, bring out those details that he has stored in his mind, and simply help him synthesize that to get to the application. Now, I keep using the term details application, but for your subject or for a certain concept, maybe it'll be easier for you to think part, whole. Before I ask the whole question, let me make sure they know the parts. It could be easier for you to think step, answer. Or it could be easier for you to think reason, conclusion. What I like about that last one is it makes me think of geometry and the proofs and the theorems that students solve in geometry. Geometry rewired my brain. So geometry teachers, you are special teachers who get the opportunity to really help your students think. But if in our review, we review the thinking process, then every teacher can have a little bit of a geometry teacher in him as he challenges the students to think logically through how he gets to his answer and thus be able to apply it in any situation. So those are the three aspects of daily review that I've asked us to consider. And of course, before I leave intensity, let me also mention that part of reviewing the thinking process can include asking those simple questions of why and how. In fact, in the clip that we're about to watch, we're going to see just a few sections of an English teacher reviewing adjective clauses with his students. So they need to tell him what the adjective clause is. But to make sure they're not just guessing and to make sure they know why that's the adjective clause, listen to the questions that he asks them.
So tell us what your dependent clauses were, just so we're all clear.
My dependent clause was that shall humble himself,
Good. And how'd you know that was a dependent clause?
because that was a signal word.
Good. We had the signal word that started it off.
And then the other clause, I think. No, I didn't have no clause. Never mind.
Is he right? Is there another clause? No, there's not another clause. You're right. Good. James, how would you know there's not another clause in that sentence? What would you have to have in order for there to be another clause in the sentence?
A signal word, right?
A signal word, yes. And you also would have to have, what do all clauses have that makes them different from phrases?
Subject and verb.
Yeah, they would have to have a subject and a verb. Raise your hand if you agree. Raise your hand if you disagree. Joseph, I see your hand. Why do you disagree?
I found the clause until the bird reaches maturity.
Yes, now this was a tricky one. The word until normally is not a signal word. Joseph, how'd you know to find that clause? What was your clue?
Because bird is your subject and reaches is your verb.
Yes, you have a subject and a verb there with bird reaches. Was it correct though? Was that a compound complex sentence? Yes, it was. Why was it compound? It had how many independents? Two. How many dependents? One. Good. All right, you can go ahead and put those away and get out your literature books and open those up to page 371.
Notice how he kept the other students involved. He would often ask them if they agreed or disagreed with the student who answered, if they had found anything else, and then he'd ask them why or how did you know. That really kept the students on their toes and thinking. He may not need to do it with every single question. Again, you balance out with the time that you have, but if you get in the practice of doing that frequently, of making students support their answers, you're really establishing a thinking process that they can continue go back to. Now, as I said, these three aspects of review, they are going to be variety, frequency, and of course, intensity. How are you doing in those three aspects? Is there maybe one of those aspects that you can focus on in this coming year to just take your review to that next level? I promised you that we would end just by a few mentions of test review or cumulative review. Now, in the Abeka curriculum, we give tests about every 2.5 to 3 weeks. So you'll typically have 12 tests throughout the school year. And test reviews are a little lengthier, sometimes a lot lengthier than daily review, and so they lend themselves to adding a little bit of a game or a competition. And for that reason, I, like my students, enjoy having games with review. But not every subject that I teach naturally lends itself to using games with review. I think sometimes of grammar review if you're a grammar teacher, and certainly this past year with the Spanish review, often the way we were reviewing and the exercises we had in the book didn't lend themselves to games, and that's okay. The most important part is that you're reviewing the concepts with your students. Pop in a game when you can and when it fits. In fact, let me address you math teachers. Math teachers will often come to me and say, how do I incorporate games in my classroom? And I think that's a good question. I didn't do it too frequently when I was teaching math, but I talked to one of our math teachers here, Miss Shauna Smith, and asked what she suggested. And she says that often what she'll do is she'll still go through the exercises, have students come to the board, go over the answers, but then after each section, she'll have each student show how many points or how many problems he got correct when he did that and checked his answers. So she'll tally up the points from each student, and then those points go toward the team that he represents. And so at the end of the lesson, which team has the most points? You can make it by dividing your class into 2 teams. You can do teams by row. You can even do teams individually, just to add some variety within that. But before we get to some game ideas, let me mention some quick tips for test review. And that is, first, don't review from the test. 2 reasons why. Number 1, you have some very smart yet lazy students. And when you're reviewing from the test, especially when you're reading the questions verbatim, those smart but lazy students who have been checking out for the last 2.5 weeks, just check back in for review day, hear the answers, and then they're good to go to get an A or B on the test the next day. And then they'll be lazy again until the next test review. You don't want to encourage that. Instead, what you want them to do is be paying attention the whole time, because if they just check in for review, that's not enough for them. So do have questions prepared. Now, that doesn't mean you need to start from scratch. If you have written down questions on a daily basis, now you have a wide repertoire to use, but also your curriculum itself. At the end of each chapter or unit, there are those reviews that you can use and just add in your questions to it, so you don't have to start from scratch. The second is, if you are planning on a game, prioritize reviewing content, not playing the game. There's a lot of fun game ideas out there that I've never used, because they would put more focus on the game that we're playing, or more time on the game that we're playing, than on the content review. So do balance that out. If you happen to be at one of those rare instances in your teaching career when you have more time than content and you need to spread things out, great. Include one of those more complex games. But otherwise, focus on reviewing content, not playing the game. Here's some ideas that I've taken in, either from ideas that I've used or ideas that even this past year I saw some of my fellow teachers use. And the first group of ideas are more digital ideas. These particular teachers were using them on iPads, but I've looked up each of the apps that I happen to mention, and they also have other types of apps that work for different operating systems. So if you're more of a Windows person rather than Apple, or vice versa, there should be parallel or similar apps for each of those domains. The first is called Classroom Roulette. And as you see, the benefit of this is you could add multiple spokes and fill those spokes with names or point values or terms. There's a lot of different options that you could have here. In fact, one particular game that Mr. Mike Smith, who had used this through this past year, that I want to show you, since he was teaching U.S. history, he found another app that was called Electoral. And what he would do is he would divide his class into 2 teams, and a typical game formation, have a representative from each team, and so they're facing off each other, who can answer the question the fastest and the most accurately. So when a student answered a question correctly, he would spin the wheel, and whatever state the wheel lands on, you could press that on the app, and that state goes to that team. But as you know, when it comes to the Electoral College, it's not about the state, it's about how many seats are in that state. So that just adds a real neat addition to the game idea, where you could get fewer states but still win the game because there were more seats in those states. Something else that this teacher did was he took one of his maps and he simply made the map kind of a board for his game. And so as students answer the questions correctly, they could either go just to the next point and who can be the first to get to the end of that game, or you could even add in, like, roll a dice or spin the wheel. How many spaces do you get to move? Now, what I really like about this last example is that you can apply this to any class that you're teaching. Say you teach English and you're in love with Shakespeare. Take a picture of the Globe Theater, and as they answer the questions, they're trying to move through the map or the drawing in the Globe Theater that you've created them to follow. Maybe it's biology. Take a picture maybe of the human body or the circulatory system, and they have to go through the circulatory system and see who can be the first to get there. So lots of application that you can make with this one. Here are some ideas that I got from Miss Colette Stansel, our biology teacher. In fact, I had gotten these ideas from her a couple years ago, just on the off chance that I could share with other teachers, and here I have that opportunity. She used an app called Note Shelf. It's now in its 2.0 version, but again, there are complementary apps for other operating systems, and similar to what we just saw with Mr. Smith, she created her own board game that students, as they answered questions, would progress through. Now, you see that there are various blockades in this game that she's created. And what happens is when a team gets to a blockade, they have to answer a certain number of questions in a row based upon how many objects are in that blockade. So once they get to the fishes, they have to answer 2 questions in a row. Once they get to the bears, they have to answer 3 questions in a row. And she's just created a number of these through the years. She keeps them on storage there in her iPad, as you can see, and she just pulls them out when she can use them. Something else that she's done, also very simple. Notice that's what I'm emphasizing. Very simple, easy to make games. And she's taken pictures, she's duplicated them, 1 picture for each team, and then as the team answers a question correctly, instead of getting a point, they poke a little hole, in this case, through the bear. Something else that I just thought was too cute not to share was she took a picture of the class skeleton. And so in that same app, as they answered a question, they would put little images, in this case little frogs, on the class skeleton. Who can get the most frogs on the class skeleton? So minimal prep, very easy to do. And you might be able to add some personality and some content also to the picture that you happen to use. The next image that I want to show you is something that I've done myself, and that is where I will get fly swatters from the Dollar Tree. And so again, we have 2 teams. We have a contestant from each team, and he comes up to the screen. Because what I have projected on the screen is a grid with the answers to the questions that I'm about to ask. What you see in front of you are Spanish question words. So I will ask the question word in English, and the students need to SWOT what is the correct question word in Spanish. The benefit of having this on a projector screen is I can go from slide to slide. As soon as they finish swatting all the answers on a particular slide, we just go to the next one. Now, you can also use, instead of, because this does take time to populate the answers, maybe with your vocab words, maybe with your history or science terms, but you can also just have the letters of the alphabet, A through Z, and ask a question, and they have to SWOT the first letter of the word that is the answer. And then you can just stay on A through Z. You can use the numbers 1 through 9 and then 0. Maybe you're asking about dates, and the students have to SWOT the last number of the date that is the answer to your question. Using the alphabet, using numbers also works well if you just have a chalkboard. And obviously you can't quickly create an answer grid every time they finish it up. So if you just have the letters of the alphabet or the numbers there, you can keep using them for multiple types of questions. But there's a lot of application that you can do for that one. The last example I want to give you is also from Spanish class, but this works well for others. Anytime you need students to fill in some type of chart or information, make it into a relay. This I've done multiple times on the chalkboard. It took me just a minute or 2 before a class to quickly make the 2 grids on the chalkboard, divide the class into 2 teams, and have the students line up. And then the first student, in this case from each team, needs to run to the board and needs to fill in that first box. He needs to conjugate aceptar in the yo form. He runs back to his team to the back of the line, and the second person goes up and he needs to fill in the second box, in this case the aceptar form of tú, and so on and so forth. So I usually give 3 to 5 points if they finished first, but then we go over the answers after everyone has filled them in, and they get a point for every correct answer. So speed only goes so far. We are looking for accuracy. Like I said, this would apply to anything that you can make some type of chart or information for. What immediately came to mind, English teachers, was when you have the students take verbs and put them in the different tenses. As you see in front of you, that creates a grid. I would often use this as kind of a fun review with my students to go over the tenses. So I trust that you may be able to apply some of these review games as you saw them presented, but most likely you'll be able to see them and adapt them to your classroom situation and to your subject, and that they would just give you more ideas that would build from there. I've appreciated the time that you have spent watching this. We've kind of covered a lot of information, so the good thing is this video should still be accessible for about the next year. You might take just a few tidbits from it this time and come back to it in 6 months and see what else you can apply. But again, the emphasis here is that review is what builds longevity into learning. Because once we've done all the work of teaching our students a new concept, we don't want to lose the student's opportunity to quickly and easily refer back to that new information that he's made. So keep those pathways trodden down in their mind and make those pathways permanent. And I trust that you will work with review in your classes in this coming year.